a new fantastic discovery. The inscription of the 24th year of Darius the Great. Too bad it's a fake. On this Manna Machine Alert. Today we're going to discuss a recent news article that talked about a ostracon that was found in Israel that had an inscription on it discussing the 24th year of Darius the Great. Now, this discovery hit all the newspapers, and almost overnight came the retractions. So we're going to discuss this particular little saga, what happened, and what we can learn from this. So stay tuned, whereas when I talk this over with my producer Kiara on this Manna Machine Alert, as we sort of go into the intricacies of what happened, what went wrong, and what we can learn from this. Okay? All right. We're going to actually start with the original Jerusalem Post article here, which basically broke the story.
And this was incredible breaking news when it broke.
Everyone was excited about this. Okay, it was really, really excited, but we have to understand that how rapidly these events took off. This was posted on Wednesday, March 1st.
Yes.
So this is only a couple days old already.
Yeah, so this is groundbreaking news. But the second story broke shortly after that.
Really shortly after. Okay.
So on Wednesday, March 1st.
The Jerusalem Post announced that the discovery of an ostracon found at Tel Lachish National Park, which is an archaeological park. Okay, that's the site of the ancient city of Lachish. And it's had on the inscription basically saying the 24th year of Darius. Now, the potsherd was discovered by accident by Elon Levy, who also happens to be a high-profile person. He is the international media advisor to Israeli President Isaac Herzog. And what he did was he turned it over to the Israeli Antiquities Authority. He looked at it, he saw there was an inscription on it, and he turned it over to the Israeli Antiquities Authority to basically examine.
Basically, for our viewers, when you're on these sites in Israel, you are allowed to just wander around, and anything that's on the ground and a broken potsherd, you are allowed to touch it, look at it, pick it up, and in a lot of cases take it home, because there's so many potsherds in Israel. They don't have the same rules and regulations that a lot of other countries have.
Yes.
So this man was just walking along, flipping over potsherds, and he found something.
Yes. The belief of the Israeli Antiquities Authority is if a potsherd is found on the surface, it doesn't have an archaeological context. Because it doesn't have an archaeological context, it doesn't have the same archaeological value of something found in situ, which means in an actual dig in context. This is why they allow you in Israel to take stuff on the surface home if it's not of archaeological significance. But he saw there was an inscription of it, so he thought this could be of archaeological significance.
The article actually reads, "When I picked up the ostracon and saw the inscription, my hands shook. I looked left and right for the cameras because I was sure someone was playing an elaborate prank on me," said Levy. "When I was walking around here with a friend and just exploring the history, I was turning over pieces of pottery and stones with my hand, and suddenly I found that it had letters on it, and I thought, this is too good to be true."
Now, his instincts were actually correct, but he did the right thing. He did the right thing, and he turned it over to the antiquities authorities. And that's the right thing. If you find an ostraca with an inscription, you turn it over to an authority for them to examine. When he did turn it over to the authorities, 3 people at the Israeli Antiquities Authority were skeptical. They were immediately skeptical.
But intrigued.
They were intrigued, but they were skeptical. A few weeks later, Levy received as I'm reading from the article here, received a phone call from Sa'ar Ganor of the Israeli Antiquities Authority and said that he was, quote, on his way from the Dead Sea Scrolls lab. We've put it through 3 scanners. This is authentic. No modern hand could do it, and it's from 2,500 years ago, from before the story of Purim. End quote. Now, the story of Purim, for those who are not familiar with the book of Esther, is the story of how the Israelites were saved from being butchered while under Persian rule under King Ahasuerus. The context here would have been that if this inscription dates to the time of Darius the Great, Darius was the father of Xerxes, which we know in Esther as Ahasuerus. So this would have been concerning the father of the king that Esther married. So that would have been the historical context. So that's what Ganor is doing here, is he's put it through 3 scanners, he's thinking it's legit, and then he's assigning a date to it.
And he gets very, very excited.
He thinks this is real. And the Jerusalem Post goes on to say that the inscription reads, Year 4 of Darius, which dates back to 498 BCE. The king's reign beginning in 522 BCE and ending in 486 BCE. But he's not the only one that vouches for this. Eli Escozido, director of the Israel Antiquities Authority, stated, quote, It's amazing that visitors to the site come across such a rare inscription reviving the Persian King Darius known to us from the sources. His son, King Ahasuerus, could never have imagined that we would find evidence of his father in Israel 2,500 years after the dramatic events in his royal court, end quote. So in the Jerusalem Post article, now we have 2 archaeologists vouching for it. So that's interesting here that we have 2 guys here who've just gone on the limb for this thing.
They've done their tests that they normally run, and they validated from the scanners that this is a piece of ancient pottery.
Mm-hmm.
And on this ancient pottery, they're reading the inscription of King Darius.
Of King Darius, yes.
So based on that, they pronounce it authentic.
Yeah, based on their the tests that they ran through the 3 scanners, they pronounce it authentic. Okay.
Part 2 of the story, however.
Part 2 of the story, 2 days later, there is an announcement made by the Israeli Antiquities Authority. And I'm reading the first one that came from ynet.co.il, which is actually was a Hebrew article. It was just translated here into English. And it reads, a researcher from abroad confessed that she was the one who wrote the inscription on ancient pottery and left it at Tel Lachish, which in fact created a deception. The chief scientist of the Antiquities Authority said, quote, leaving the engraved inscription at the site was negligent. This led to the misleading of the researchers and disruption of scientific truth, end quote. This is not a rare piece from the period before Purim, but a forgery that misled even the best researchers in Israel. The Israeli Antiquities Authority announced at noon Friday that the pottery found by travelers at Tel Lachish bearing the inscription Darius year 24, the father of Harashrosh, is not authentic. It goes on to say, following the publication, a researcher from abroad who last August participated in the excavations of a foreign expedition at Tel Lachish contacted the authority yesterday. The researcher is one of the few in the world specializing in transcriptions of the ancient Aramaic language. So, she's an expert on Aramaic.
And very rare.
And very rare.
There's not like
There's
dozens of
not
experts.
dozens of these. Yeah. She's a specialist in the field. The researcher confessed that she, and her gender is identified here, demonstrated to a group of students the engraving of the inscription on the ancient pottery. And after, she then left the find in the mound, something that in retrospect created confusion. The researcher was questioned, and according to her, she had no malicious intent. Then, quote, the Antiquities Authority takes responsibility for the incident, end quote, said Professor Gideon Avni, the authority's chief scientist. Quote, the pottery was studied by Dr. Haggai Meshgav, a world-renowned expert on ancient Aramean script, and by archaeologist Sa'ar Ganor, who studies at Tel Lachish. So there was another one who put his name on the line. We now have 3 researchers who had originally put their names on the line authenticating this thing. But it turns out we came across an inscription in disguise. Professor Avni added, as an organization whose scientific truth is a candle to its feet, we are obliged to correct the mistake before the public. He added, from an ethical scientific point of view, the incident is very serious. Leaving the engraved inscription on the site was negligent, and this led to the misleading of researchers and the disruption of scientific truth. You can count on one hand incidents of this type that have happened in archaeological research, end quote. According to him, quote, the incident illustrates the danger that exists in adding modern writing on top of ancient objects, a subject that has occupied the scientific community for many years. At the same time as the paleographic examination by an experienced experts, okay, the object was tested in laboratories and found to be ancient pottery. This proves once again that only an object that is discovered in an orderly excavation and comes out of the ground in the eyes of archaeologists is 100% real. Every other object that is discovered raises question marks, end quote. And the article ends, in light of the event, the Antiquities Authority will refresh the procedures among all foreign excavation delegations operating in Israel. Okay, so that's the retraction.
Yeah. And the timeline was, it was announced on a Wednesday. She contacted them on Thursday. They made a second announcement on Friday.
Mm-hmm.
So people got very excited, then very disappointed.
Yeah.
So.
Now, there are some issues to this that these 2 particular articles did not raise that really should be raised as a result of this.
Well, I can think of one off the top of my head. I'm sure you're going to get to it. Don't teach your students how to do forgeries.
Let's get to that one too. But I think one of the things that did go right was that the researcher who created the object confessed.
Immediately.
She recognized it. She recognized it was hers, and she immediately fessed up to it.
She heard the announcement as soon as everybody else in the archaeological community heard it. That day, she immediately calls it in.
Yeah. She did the right thing. Okay? we had two people here in this particular story that did the right thing.
Yes.
Levy did the right thing by turning the inscription into the Antiquities Authority. The researcher who created the artifact did the right thing by confessing that it was a modern fake. Not intentionally made to be a fake, but a fake nonetheless.
Yes.
Now, with that said, let's talk about what went wrong. Because there's a lot here that went wrong.
But they did mitigate it.
They did mitigate it.
By immediately saying this was a mistake.
Yeah. Now, unfortunately, the retractions are not getting the same coverage that the original article did.
That's pretty typical.
That's very typical. Lies get out there a lot quicker and spread a lot faster than...
And that's not the antiquities department's
that's
problem.
That's just how truth disseminates in general.
Yeah. Lies go much, much faster than...
Yeah. The old saying is, the lie has traveled around the world before the truth gets its shoes on.
Yeah.
And it's very true.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that we're just going to be coming across this for years to come. People are going to raise this for years to come.
Yes. And no matter that you point out that this was a find that was denounced
2 days later,
2 days later by the person who did it, there will always be people who insist the inscription of King Darius's 24th year was found.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is going to become a perennial problem. Just because that's the way these things sort of shake out.
Yeah.
Okay? So we can anticipate that. But that's not the only thing that went wrong here. The whole fact that this researcher created this artifact to begin with is a problem. Okay? What she did was she took a potsherd, which were common enough. They're common enough that a researcher could just find a potsherd on the surface and create a ostraca for demonstration purposes. She did it by scratching it, which is one of the more difficult methods to detect a forgery, as opposed to using a brush and ink.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So, the protocol on these certain things is to mark them, to first of all, not let them go back onto the site. She disposed of it there. That was a problem.
But she misstepped one of the protocol, which is you write on the back that this was in English or some modern language.
Yeah.
That this was created on this day.
Yeah. Yeah. There are ways you identify basically a teaching tool as a teaching tool.
Yeah. And creating teaching tools is valid.
Yeah, creating teaching tools is valid.
But you clearly distinguish.
Yeah.
This is a modern work.
The Egyptian Museum, the Supreme Council of Antiquities, is now creating master forgeries. Basically, but they have an identification and a serial number on them so that you know they're not legitimate. They are there for study purposes.
Yeah, I assume they're for display purposes.
Display purposes, museums, study purposes, that sort of thing.
Letting students of archaeology see the process.
Yeah.
Which is what she claimed she was doing for hers.
Yeah, she claimed that she was taking a potsherd and creating an ostraca through an engraving.
Clearly proving she is, in fact, an expert in that language.
she did fool three experts in inscriptions in ostraca.
But then people who are experts in these ancient Near Eastern languages do that in their spare time. They doodle in these languages in various mediums just to keep the language fresh.
Yes. Yes. So, she did produce a very convincing ostraca.
Yes.
The problem was what she did after with it.
Yes.
Once she was done with the teaching instrument, she disposed of it incorrectly and probably would have been better off marking it as she created it.
Or marking it before she created and then create it.
Yeah.
Just so you don't forget.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there was a violation of protocols. So that's the first thing that went wrong. The second thing that went wrong here was the fact that the experts used scanners to try to detect this as a forgery. The problem with scanners is that they're a kind of optical instrument. The best tests for determining forgeries is actually chemical.
How would they have been able to determine a modern chemical composition when she carved it?
Well, if she used an iron instrument, it would have left traces of metal in the grooves that are then can be sampled and then detected for trace isotopes that are modern. But this is the problem that we do find with a lot of labs now. Scanners are cheap.
Chemical tests are expensive.
Chemical tests are expensive and complicated.
And there was no reason to doubt this one.
Yeah, that was the other thing. It was found
at the site.
It was found at the site.
Just not in situ.
No, just not in situ, yeah. Yeah, so there is a problem with that. It was given the presumption of innocence. Which brings us to the next thing that went wrong, which is the presumption of innocence. It was given a stamp of authenticity, even though it was a surface find.
Yes, they mentioned that in the article.
They did mention that in the article.
They recanted.
Yeah. This has always been a problem with stuff that doesn't have an archaeological context. This, as we said earlier, this is why the Israeli Antiquities allows you to take potsherds found on the surface home sometimes. Because it does not have an archaeological context when it's on the surface.
It could be authentic.
Could be.
Could be. But there's no way of knowing 100%.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And usually scholars use terms that don't make it to the media, which is most likely.
Yeah.
In all probability.
Yeah.
We can be reasonably sure that.
Yeah.
But this was authenticated.
Yeah. So it should have been that when they found out this was a surface find, rather than jumping to authenticating it as true, they should have said, we don't have any reason to doubt at this point. They should have hedged their bets.
And it's annoying.
Or it looks promising.
Yes. It's annoying to do that because you want to be excited about your find.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the man who found it said he looked around to see cameras. He thought somebody was playing a prank on him.
Mm-hmm.
He was really excited. He turns it over to the authorities. And according to the articles, she used an antique potsherd.
Mm-hmm.
So that did lend one level of authentication.
Mm-hmm.
The carving wasn't legit.
Yeah. So, again, what we're dealing with here is something that the three researchers that vouched for this should not have done so in absolute terms.
Without doing the final test of a chemical analysis.
Or at least as part of their suite. The chemical analysis might have shown nothing. But just using scanners.
And what would have happened if she had actually used a tool appropriate for the time, which if she's an expert and she's showing students, she could have done. That, all the testing in the world would have shown up as authentic
if she had used any sort of modern ink on that. It also would have been shown it to probably have been a forgery. But there is a lot that there's more that should have been done. It might have had the same result. That's possible, but they didn't do it. I think that's an issue. Scanners alone aren't enough. Their stamp of authenticity of this puts into serious doubt also their lab processes, because they didn't go through at least thorough enough protocols before declaring it authentic. And I think that's an issue.
Well, I think they did come around on that, where they said, this proves once again that only an object that is discovered in an orderly excavation and comes out of the ground in the eyes of the archaeologist is 100% real.
Yeah.
So they got the reminder of that, even though it was found on a legitimate site. It looked legitimate. It's on a 2,500-year-old pot shard. And they didn't think any modern person would have been able to do that kind of carving. But it just goes to prove that somebody who is an expert at it can, in fact, create a very realistic fake.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I think that's a lesson we can take away from this. The other thing I want to bring up too, another thing that went wrong in my opinion, is the fact that it went to the newspapers first. It went right to the Jerusalem Post.
You're saying it should have gone to academic press first.
Exactly.
And had other academics then come in and verify it.
This has been a big, big problem over the last couple years, where researchers are going to the newspapers before the academic presses. And now we have Israeli Antiquities Authorities representatives going to the newspapers. People should know better. This should have been announced at a conference.
Yes. And then you'd have a dozen people say, but it wasn't found in the ground. It wasn't dug up. It was on the surface. Something like this just found on the surface. What other tests have you run?
Yeah. There would have been some academic pushback. So I think this should have gone through to proper channels first.
And this is the reason why the protocol of the academy is what it is.
Yeah.
It's not stuffy. It's not just tradition. There's a plan and a purpose for it, which is people who are also archaeologists, also experts, maybe not in that particular site, that particular era, but they are experts in the protocol.
Yeah. And this is not the first time a result has appeared first in a newspaper that has been a little bit suspect.
Which makes it somewhat suspicious. And it makes people like me think, well, maybe that's why they went to the newspaper first. Because it was a little sus. So if you're solid, you're sure, you'd have no hesitation presenting it at a conference.
Yeah.
You would have no hesitation presenting it to your peers. And what we're seeing more and more and more is people who are doing media archaeology.
Well, having now, like, for example, the Mount Ebal curse amulet, now that I've seen some of the epigraphy that has gone into that result, there are some serious questions that researchers are going to raise over. Yes, they went right to the newspapers. They announced their translations. They didn't show any photographs, any epigraphic drawings, but there's some serious methodological and epigraphical concerns over that. Because, frankly, it looks strange. Really, really strange for a inscription.
And again, the best thing that happened in this case
Mhm.
was the archaeologist who created the piece
Mm-hmm.
was negligent,
Yeah.
should have signed it,
Yeah.
made a mistake, but she immediately came forward. She hears it on the news and goes, oh no, I know what that is.
Yeah.
And she doesn't hesitate. She makes the call immediately.
Now, there was recently a bunch of archaeologists who signed a petition against doing newspaper archaeology. Basically, they say that if you have a result, go to the peer review process first. Don't take it to the newspapers because it can disseminate bad information.
So
Here's a great example of it.
what can be done, because there are more and more newer people in pretty much any field that have not been trained properly. And they are going more and more to be media-based
Mhm.
rather than academics.
Mhm.
They're not actually scholars.
Yeah.
They're sensationalists.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've had you do it on my papers on totally different subject.
Mhm.
You've said, oh, you can't say that. You have to say, probably true, might be true. It's suggested that. And it takes the oomph out of it. It takes the emotional, wow, this is so cool out of it. But that's what a scholar is.
That's the price you pay for precision. The price you pay for precision.
Not only precision, but academic integrity.
Yes.
We are seeing a profound lack of academic integrity.
Yes.
Not in this case.
No, not in this case.
Want to be very clear. All parties involved acted with integrity.
Yes. Yeah. We want to be, absolutely. We want to be clear about that. Everyone here has acted with integrity.
The person who created the piece was doing a demonstration
Mm-hmm.
to teach her students.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't dispose of it properly, but created the piece with integrity.
Yes.
The man who found it acted with integrity. He couldn't believe it, but he found it, turns it over to the proper authorities.
Yes.
The authorities test it.
Yeah.
They just didn't go necessarily far enough.
There was no malfeasance here.
Yeah.
But mistakes were made.
And the biggest act of integrity is they said, oh my gosh, mistakes were made.
Yeah.
We're going to own up to it publicly right away. This is the difference between a Wednesday release and a Friday release. This is 2 days of each other.
Yeah.
As soon as it was released, the woman who made the mistake on site calls it in,
Mm-hmm.
and it's released.
Yeah.
As soon as they hear about it.
A lot of things went right, but a lot of things went wrong. This is just one of those cases where mistakes happened because protocols weren't followed.
So what?
Protocols weren't followed at the archaeological site of Tel Lachish during the excavation. Protocols weren't followed in the lab. Protocols weren't followed in the media relations.
Well, that is a very hot topic in and of itself, is the fact that the media doesn't seem to have any protocols that it follows anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, back in the 1950s,
Mm-hmm.
Newspapers were granted legal protection from revealing their sources.
Yeah.
Because they had such an incredible amount of integrity.
Mm-hmm.
No newspaper publisher would publish an article he had not made sure was thoroughly researched to be authentic.
Yeah.
So there were protocols in various fields in place. And 21st century, it seems like everybody's going for what's going to get me the most attention.
Yeah. Now, I think there's one other thing we do need to cover for as mistakes made, which is the secondary sources. Basically, the secondary resenders of the information. Because the Jerusalem Post article was not limited to just the newspaper. It was released in electronic format, and it was distributed widely on Twitter and Facebook. Many people made reposts of the article, spreading it widely.
And they're not reposting
Retraction.
the retraction.
Yes. So here's the thing. There was a lot of people that just sort of latched onto this and ran with it. This is one of the reasons why responsible scholars wait. See what fleshes out. What does the peer review process produce? Because there are times when, like this happens, find out it was an intentional forgery. You find out that someone spilled some ink. Things happen.
You kind of, listening to what you're saying, I kind of get the idea that if they had followed proper procedures and presented this at a conference, the archaeologist who left her teaching school there would have gone, oops, and this would have stayed very quiet. She would have talked to them after their presentation and said, we have a problem. I have something to confess.
It could have happened that way.
And it could have been very quiet. And that's the reason those protocols are followed.
Or someone could have come along later on and said, well, hey, that character doesn't look quite right. Because that's happened too, where a forgery was made, it's deemed authentic to begin with, and then some researcher later on goes, well, in that period of time, the race is just a little different. Or the spelling's not quite right. Now, in this particular case, she's an expert. Chances of messing up in that way is probably a lot less.
It was a very short.
It's a very short inscription, too. But it is the sort of thing that that has happened.
Yeah, and it's something that it can just catch somebody out of the corner of their eye and they went, hey, wait a minute.
Well, this is what happened with Karen King. When she published the papyrus that had the statement that Jesus was married. Later on, a researcher looked at that text and said, hey, the spelling and orthography isn't right here. This is probably a forgery. Doubled down on it. It was conclusively proven it was a forgery.
Well, again, the biggest problem is people finding what they want to.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
So, this can happen to the best of us.
So, it seems in summary,
there's
several protocols that were not.
There was protocols that weren't followed. Mistakes were made, and it created confusion in the scientific community and to the general public.
The scientific community is correcting itself.
Yes.
It's the general public that this is going to linger on.
This is going to linger on in the general public for years to come. So, that covers the most recent announcement regarding the Darius inscription. That it was a fake that had been discovered by accident, and mistakes were made. Now, we hope that you take away from this that when a fantastic claim is made, to wait and see what happens. Because sometimes the truth comes out in such a way that goes contrary to the first impressions. Anyway, we hope you found today's video interesting and informative. Thank you for watching this Manna Machine Alert, and we will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.